Hello, this is Chris Morris, and welcome to part two of the Shroud of Turin presentation. For those of you that did not watch part one, you really should, okay? Because I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing what we talked about in part one. During that part one, I kind of gave you an overview of what the Shroud of Turin is, what the undisputable facts are about it. When I mean undisputable, I mean all those that have studied the Shroud agree on a certain key number of facts that in and of themselves are fairly amazing. This is whether they be religious or non-religious, whether they come from a Catholic background, whether they're Hindu, makes no difference. There are a certain pool of facts which are indeed in and of themselves simply amazing that all agree with. We then went through and chronicled, what we see on the Shroud through the gospel accounts of Christ's passion. We then kind of walked through a history of the Shroud. And the history was a combination of verifiable historical fact, which means, it's attested to in multiple sources, and some legend, especially early on. What we learned about the Abgar kings and the travels of the Shroud and the letters of Abgar and the image of Edessa. We know that really that first 500 years or so, we really have no verifiable evidence other than the pious legends that have carried forth from that period of time. So, but we do have evidence to support those legends. We do have indications that those legends could be a lot more than mere fantasy, and that they could indeed be historical fact. But I just want to be honest that we don't actually have secondary attestations and reliable sources to confirm that. That being said, I think the hypothesis that we followed is absolutely true. We get much more providential attestation when we get into the emperor, the Eastern Byzantine Empire emperor taking the Shroud from Edessa and bringing it to Constantinople, and then the chroniclers of the Fourth Crusade giving us evidence that, yes, they indeed did see the Shroud in Constantinople, and more likely than not took the Shroud from Constantinople, and that's how it got to France. We talked about the new initiation ceremony that evolved around something, likely the Shroud for the Templars, being that next thing you know is the Shroud shows up in Liry, France, in the hands of a granddaughter of a Templar master. We learned how the Shroud created quite some controversy and stirred up quite a big pilgrimage movement in the 14th century, angering the local bishop. We talked about how the royal family of the emerging nation state of France, the Savoys, ended up acquiring the Shroud and keeping it with them through their travels and for several decades, until eventually housing it in the chapel of their home castle, before eventually it is then moved into Italy on a pretense of saving the trip of a very famous cardinal, very instrumental leader of our church during the 16th century. But really, it was more of a way for that royal family to preserve their wealth and those objects that were valuable to them, as they saw that their time in power was probably coming to an end. The Savoys, lost power and were replaced in France, and the writing was on the wall. So we believe it moved to Italy merely as a means of protecting their wealth, along with most of their other valuable objects. And Italy it remained, and still remains to this day in Turin, Italy. We talked about how it did leave Turin, Italy for a short period of time during World War II for its protection when Turin was under bombing threat. But for all intents and purposes, it's remained in Turin, Italy for really the last almost 500 years now. So, we went through that history. And then we went through, what happened after that. We talked about the moment that really changed everything when the amateur photographer, Pia Segunda, took pictures of the Shroud in an effort to preserve it, realizing, hey, this thing is really starting to show some wear and tear. Let's get some good pictures now that we have this technology before it's too late. But being an amateur that he was, he messed up the processing of those film plates and ended up producing photo negatives, which lo and behold gave us incredibly detailed images of the man on the shroud. And this started a whole new craze around the shroud. Scientists around the world, starting with the French Academy of Science, which was the center of science at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. One of its leaders made a pretty bold proclamation that this is authentic. Did not go over well in the academy or in France, which had become pretty secular at the time. But again, there was really a lot of stir created into the beginning of the 20th century. And it really wasn't until World War I and then, the crises between World War I and World War II that it kind of faded a little bit. And, interest in the shroud waned right up until the 1970s. And then in the 1970s, we had a couple of events that brought it back to attention. First was an attempt to destroy it. Okay, that was not successful. Again, the shroud had always had its place in Catholic history and Christian history. And there are people that would rather it does not exist. So, it does need to be protected. And that kind of taught us a valuable lesson. And then in 1973, the work done by the NASA scientists at Colorado Springs, the Air Force scientists who worked for NASA, who used the same device they used to take the 2D images of the moon, which is a 3D object, and turn them into 3D images, just for fun, decided to run the shroud pictures through the same device, the VP8 analyzer. And they fully anticipated that it wouldn't work, that they would get another 2D image, because in their minds, as scientists, they believed that the pictures that Pia Segunda had taken at the turn of the century were 2D images of a 2D object, of a piece of artwork that was on a piece of cloth. Well, lo and behold, they get a 3D image out of it, which means that image on the cloth is not just a photo negative, but it somehow has 3D information encoded into it. Somehow it has contained or captured what was a 3D body on this piece of linen cloth. So pretty amazing there. And then that spurred the STURP project, the Shroud of Turin research project, nicknamed STURP, STURP, which was, leading scientists across multiple fields who got permission to study the shroud for a period of time, a pretty short period of time, basically a week, but they ran immense number of tests, took all sorts of samples and imagery. And then, their conclusion, they came home, studied all that data. Their conclusion was, hey, this is for real. This is a first century linen cloth that appears to show the image of a man crucified in all the ways, beaten, tortured, crucified, all the ways that Jesus was described as being treated. So they weren't able to say, hey, this is the burial cloth of Jesus, but they're saying this is the burial cloth of a first century person, most likely from Jerusalem, or at least who was buried and spent some time in and around Jerusalem in the first century, who was beaten, scourged, had a crown of thorns and a true crown. We're going to review that again a little bit, of thorns impaled on his head, crucified, speared, okay, everything that Jesus went through. And they declared it authentic, and going one step short of saying, look, we can't say it's Jesus Christ, but, there is no other historical match. And this is a tremendous historical match. So that was huge news in the 70s and into the 80s until we actually had the shroud carbon-14 date tested. And carbon-14 testing at that time was known as the single most reliable method of dating an object, a formerly living object that has carbon in it, so a carbon-based item. So the linen cloth, which was made from flax, a plant, would have had carbon in it. You can use carbon dating to determine how old that cloth is. And the carbon dating results came back and said, wait a second, it was not a first century cloth, hence it could not have been around a first century man. This cloth was created sometime in the 13th or 14th century. So they declared it a hoax, a very well-crafted medieval hoax. People were devastated. The scientists who worked on the STURP project were stunned because every test that they had run confirmed what they had reported. So we talked all about that, and that's where we kind of left it off. We're left in this big moment of disappointment. And we finished part one with me saying, give you a little spoiler alert, that actually the carbon-14 testing proved absolutely nothing. And that's where we're going to pick up today. We're going to pick up with a more detailed dive into what STIRP did, how the carbon-14 testing came about, what were some issues that we're now aware of with it, what has happened since then, what else we've learned, not just about that carbon-14 testing, which we've actually learned some really bizarre news about recently in the last few years, but also what other tests have been run since then, what the likelihood of those tests being accurate are, and what they actually tell us. And then we'll kind of go through and sum up around what it would have taken to produce this amazing image on this cloth, and what we think this means, and more importantly, what do we think it means for our faith? So let us go. And where we left off, we started talking about that 1988 issue. And really what you ended up having out of that was two very clearly opposed camps. You had those original STIRP researchers on the left. You see them there in an image from 1978. When this large team of scientists spent a week with the Shroud, running all sorts of tests and taking samples and analyzing the image. And then on the right, you're seeing the folks that reported out on the carbon-14 testing from the British Museum, basically saying, no, this thing was a late medieval hoax and definitely could not have been the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So you have these two opposing scientific views, which, by the way, is not unusual. Science is never as precise as we are sometimes led or lead ourselves into believing. And you're going to find out that's exactly what we ended up having here. We had a couple of things that have since come to light that have made it very clear what the discrepancy was between what the STIRP team found and what the carbon-14 dating revealed. So again, Camp 1, the STIRP team, burial cloth of Jesus that miraculously bears a full-size, three-dimensional image of the crucified body of our Savior, a witness to his passion and resurrection. So proof that, yes, he was killed this way and rose from the dead. Camp 2 are carbon-14 people. The Shroud is a late medieval forgery created by a master forger during a period of relic mania to take advantage of the faith of unsuspecting worshipers for financial gain. By the way, it's not an unreasonable conclusion, because there was a big trade in fake relics in the late medieval period. And again, that's why the church is so very careful with authentication and provenance of relics today, because it doesn't want to, fall into that trap where people start doubting some of these things and start doubting relics when there really is no reason to. We have providence on these things going way back. So anyway, those are the two basic camps that emerged following those 1988 data sets. So let's go back and talk about what STIRP did. Now, you're going to see lots of images of the type of testing they did with STIRP. They basically did every type of test they could think of, and they prepared for almost 2 years in advance to make sure they knew what type of test they want to run. It wasn't like they just showed up and said, well, let's try A, B, and C. They had all sorts of protocols detailed out. They followed them to a T. They knew they had limited time, basically a week, so they did them 24 hours a day to make sure they get all the tests run. They knew how long the tests would take. So it was a very precisely scheduled and executed scientific research. 33 members of the scientific team, okay? Chemists, physicists, biologists, mathematicians, pathologists, very important to make sure that you had people that were experts in analyzing the dead. And then certainly optics and image experts who could, really study the image itself and try to determine its source. Strangely enough, there was one specialty that would have been great to have that was not there, that could have actually eliminated a great deal of the back and forth between these two scientific teams. They did not bring someone who is an expert in textiles. And had they done that, they would have learned some things about the Shroud that wasn't immediately evident to these other people from other scientific disciplines. A textile expert would have noticed some things and pointed some things out that we now know, that would have really saved us a lot of pain and suffering. But you had this very, very powerful STIRP team. And these people came from everywhere. At the time in the 1970s, what you're seeing here on the screen is a list of some of the greatest scientific laboratories in the world. Certainly, there was some outside the United States that could be included on this list. But at the time, if you were going to, talk about the best of the best, this is a great place, or a great list of places to go to find them. So these weren't, high school science teachers running these tests. These were, leaders in their field and recognized leaders in their field. And not only that, these are people that came from a wide level or wide range of religious backgrounds, and that was deliberate. They didn't want to just stack it with a bunch of Catholics or Christians. They wanted people that would not have any stake in the game, that could care less whether the shroud is authentic or not, because they don't believe in Jesus Christ to begin with. So for them, it was really an academic endeavor. They wanted to make sure they had enough people, enough variation, that the results wouldn't be called into question because of religious bias. They did spend those 18 months planning the tests. And again, they had some specific goals. They wanted to say, how old is this thing? Where did it come from? And how did the image get created? So 3 very specific goals. That's what they were trying to do. They arrive in October 1978, and there you go, the beginning of 120 straight hours of on-site testing. So a 5-day work week, nonstop 24 hours by 7, or in this case by 5. Very highly scheduled, with different people working different shifts to make sure that all the tests that could be executed within the time frame they had exposure to the shroud. They were very clear. So number one, they wanted to know how old it was. They came out unanimously. This is a 1st century piece of linen, and it was created in and around Palestine, Israel. And there are multiple reasons why they believe that, multiple tests that led them to that conclusion, and they were very confident in it. They're also very confident about the image, that it wasn't painted or dyed or stained. There were no pigments. So nothing was applied to the cloth that resulted in the image being created. They said the image does indeed, as the CP8 analyzer had indicated, does contain 3-dimensional information encoded in it, which right there was a shock, because no one knows how to do that. So again, they're like, certainly in the 1st century, this was not a possibility. So how did this happen? And they also verified, especially through the forensic pathologists, that yes, this cloth was indeed in contact with a human body that had been treated the way that Christ is described to have been treated, to an excruciating level of detail. And that, this body does appear to have gone through everything he went through. And we can actually tell that from the image that's left behind, and the blood stains and other debris that were left behind on the shroud, like some of the dirt and pollen and things of that nature. However, the final image conclusion left a lot of people disappointed. Okay, so they got the dating, they got the location, so they know when, they know its origin. They told us some important things about the image, and they said, yes, this is really the real human form of a scourged and crucified man. Yes, we now know it wasn't painted on, it wasn't the product of an artist. We know a lot about the blood stains. We know that it had a lot of the albumin serum in it, which is indicating that the person that let that blood out of their body, or whose body that blood came from, was under a high degree of torture and duress, physical duress. So that makes sense. But then they end with the image is an ongoing mystery. We don't know how it was created. So these are the greatest scientists in the world, the greatest optic and photography experts in the world, and they have no idea how this image is created. That was the odd part of the report, and that's a rarity for scientists to say we don't know anything. We don't even have a viable hypothesis. So it wasn't that they didn't have any conclusions, it was that they didn't even have an hypothesis. They had no idea in what direction to turn when you're talking about the source of this image. So that brings us to the other team, the carbon-14 dating team. And the image you see here is of a very important person, Willard Libby, who is sitting down with the pipe. He actually discovered the carbon-14 dating model in the 1940s and received the Nobel Prize for his work. So this is incredible scientific advancement in our world in the 20th century, a century in which I was born, although many of you probably watching this were not. But he came up with a hypothesis that all living organisms have carbon in them, and that's true of all living organisms we know on Earth. And carbon decays over time. The isotopes of carbon decay. So, there's carbon and then there's different isotopes of carbon. And we know the rate at which carbon isotopes decay. So we know the basic percentage of each isotope that would be naturally occurring in a living organism. So, living organisms have X percent of carbon-14. And we know the speed at which it decays. And what Libby says, well, knowing those two things, we can just measure how much is left. And in measuring how much is left, we know how long it's been since this thing died. And that's really what carbon-14 tells you. It tells you how much time has passed since the death of a living organism. In the case of the Shroud of Turin, you're like, wait a second, this wasn't, this cloth wasn't a living organism, but yes, it was. So the shroud is linen, but it's made from the plant flax. Flax was a living organism. So what we can do with carbon dating theoretically is identify when the flax was killed that was used to actually make this cloth. So we know flax decays pretty quickly if untreated and unprocessed. So it's not like flax could be cut down in the 1st century and then not used to create a cloth until the 10th century. That's just not feasible. So it was a reasonable test to run to determine, hey, if we could say that the flax was 1st century death time, that would be a really strong indicator that validates the STURP team's results. Now, he developed this in the 40s, but it took him a while for this to really get mastered. Matter of fact, early carbon dating was notoriously unreliable, and others had to come in and help perfect the technique. And really what they learned was, unfortunately, many things that they were testing had been compromised because of exposure to other sources of carbon. So, for example, if you're testing something that was exposed to a fire, well, fire, releases an enormous amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And if this thing was in that atmosphere, it would have absorbed that carbon, which would completely throw off the carbon dating results. So they had to come up with methods to clean their test samples and minimize the potential deviation they would get because of contaminants where the item they're testing was located. So that's what happened over the next couple of decades. And really by the 70s and certainly into the 80s, carbon-14 had gotten very reliable, and it was also quite easy to identify when it wasn't reliable. Okay, so at that point, Cardinal Ballestero, who was in charge of the shroud at the cathedral in Turin, was approached, and he said, "Sure, go ahead, let's carbon date this thing." He was very confident that the STURP results would be confirmed. They sat down. In fact, the STURP researchers contacted the carbon-14 dating team and said, "Guys, let's make sure that we have a good protocol here. So let's lie out how you're going to do this." And everyone agreed that the best way to do it would be to take 7 different samples from 7 different places on the shroud and send those samples to 7 different labs. And then have a control lab do all 7 on top of that, just to make sure that we could confirm the results and we had a good blind test and we weren't just potentially getting distorted by a contaminant here or there. So they agreed with that. They come in to go and do the test. So on October 13, 1988, they announce the results and they say, boom, it's a fake. All right. As a matter of fact, Professor Edward Hall, who's the gentleman on the far left in this image, the guy who has the smirk on all the time, just looks like, "I told you so." He talks about a medieval hoax, and he says there was a multi-million-pound business in making forgeries during the 14th century. Someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it, which is just, a belittling comment, quite frankly. If you hear the recording of it, I wish I could play it for you, but it's not public domain. He clearly was just smug about the whole thing and like, you idiots, how could you ever believe this? So this was stunning to the STIRP team. Again, these were the, brightest minds on the planet, and how could they have all been fooled? And that's when we say, wait a second, Professor Hall. So the STIRP team went back and they all started re-looking at all their data, and then they noticed something, okay? They started looking at the data that Professor Hall and the British Museum announced, and they recognized there's something wrong here. There's some data missing. And what happened was when they went to take the carbon-14 samples and they get to Turin, even though the cardinal had given them permission to do so, the actual guardian of the shroud, when he found out they were going to cut 7 1-inch holes in the shroud in 7 different places to take samples, lost his mind, said, no, you are not. You are not cutting a bunch of holes into the shroud. So he said, what I'd like you to do is get as far away from the image as possible, and you can take 1 sample. So it went from a protocol of 7 samples that were going to go to 7 labs. Now we're down to 1 sample, and instead of multiple places on the shroud, it's going to be taken from a corner, which would be the farthest place you can get away from the image. Well, here's a problem, okay? If you remember back, the shroud had been subjected to fires and repairs, and often it was displayed and held by its edges. And the Poor Clare nuns had repeatedly fixed the shroud. They sewed the backing on it. They reinforced its edges. So what we have here is they took a sample of an area of the shroud that had probably been repaired multiple times over the years. And then they also neglected to do a very important thing. They did no on-site testing of the shroud to verify contamination, because if there's enough contamination in the cloth, they wouldn't even run the test. But they neglected to run this on-site test, which is odd because for literally centuries, the shroud was stored in the open air in a church with candles lit all the time and smoke and incense being swung. And when it was put on public display, it was done so outside in an age when, to keep warm, fires were built and smoke and, especially as we got closer to the industrial age, contaminants in the air were widespread. So, this was something that to not do the contamination test really just was ridiculous, quite frankly. Anyway, they do this top left corner, which again was an area that had been repaired by the Poor Clare nuns multiple times. And they can prove, okay, so the STIRP team said, wait a second, we see where you took the sample. That's exactly a place where we have tests that prove that had been repaired and died somewhere after the 1532 fire. So they're like, yeah, it makes sense that your results put it in the 14th or 15th century, because what the Poor Clare nuns were trying to do when they repaired the shroud was they would always try to get a really old piece of linen to match the color so the repairs wouldn't stand out as much. So they're like, yeah, you took a sample of a repaired section that probably was repaired after the fire or at some point after that, and that proves absolutely nothing. So what the STIRP team is like is what you just proved with the fibers you tested were from about that period of time, but that tells us nothing about the original shroud and its content. In addition, some carbon-14 dating experts started to chime in and said, wait a second. They said, you probably couldn't even have done carbon-14 dating on this anyway, which is why it still hasn't been done to this day, quite frankly. Because they said this thing is probably so full of contamination, it would have to be disqualified as even a candidate for carbon-14 dating. It just would not give you reliable or repeatable results. So some fairly significant flaws. Now, the carbon-14 dating that revealed it as a shroud, that was huge news in front of every newspaper, Time magazine. The shrouds are fake. The shrouds are fake. Matter of fact, people still think that today. The debunking of the carbon-14 dating didn't even make back pages of paper because it's not big news. Matter of fact, it's the news that people don't want to hear, because all of a sudden you have to once again believe, hey, this could be the burial cloth of Jesus, and we need to start taking Jesus a little bit more seriously. So it's just interesting how this went about. So our friend Professor Hall, really the guy on the left, look at that look. really was discredited. You're going to find out he's going to be discredited even more. So let's move forward now from 1988. What happened since then? Well, 1997, again, someone tried to burn the shroud, tried to destroy it. It wasn't until then that finally they said, you know what, maybe it's time we build a protective case for two purposes. One, make it impervious to attempted destruction, so it's fireproof, shockproof, shatterproof, all that kind of good stuff. But two, it will actually hermetically seal it so we can stop any decay, because these are natural fibers. They will not last forever unless some action is taken to slow down the rate of decay. So they did that. They put in a new security system. They put in a new transport system so the shroud can be pulled out of storage without any humans touching it and displayed in a way that people can reverence it. And then we started getting people who went back, and as new dating and technologies emerged, they wanted to test the shroud. So they did. So there's a couple additional dating methods that were done in the second decade of this century, so 2012, 2013. And they took these samples that were kept by one of the photographers on the Shroud of Turin research project. What he had been doing was placing Scotch tape on the shroud in different places and pulling it up. And naturally, when you do that, if you've ever put tape on a piece of clothing and look at the tape, it has cloth fibers on it. So he had all these Scotch tape fiber samples. He literally had hundreds of them. And he gave some to a Italian scientist, Professor Fanti, who performed several different types of tests. All three of these tests said, hey, this linen cloth, it dates to somewhere either 33 AD is what he comes up with, which is just a miracle. But he says it's plus or minus 250. So it could be 250 years older than that or 250 years younger than that. So this additional dating science was not as precise, but it is much more reliable than carbon-14. So precision will get you into a very tight range, but reliability will give you repeatability of results. And he did indeed get the repeatability of results. So we're back into the first century and back into what the STURP team had originally thought. Then what ends up happening was we finally did this comparison I mentioned earlier with the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is believed to be the face cloth of Jesus Christ. So in the Gospel of John, when Peter and John look into the tomb, when they arrive after Mary said, hey, the body is gone, they see the burial cloth on one section, and then they see the face cloth rolled up specially away from it on another table or another, maybe little place in the tomb, maybe a shelf of some sort. And we believe that the Sudarium of Oviedo, at least I believe, I don't know what you believe, was indeed that cloth. And there's a whole nother talk on that if you really want to go through that. It's a beautiful thing. And we know where that's been since the 6th century. So we know for a fact that it has not moved since the 6th century. And yet there are massive number of concurrences on the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo in the blood spatter and the blood patterns. And it's an exact match from a DNA and blood type perspective. So, when we look at this and we see these 124 points of correspondence, it's very clear that both of these cloths touch the same damn body. Yet we know the Sudarium, where it's been since around the 7th century. So we know for a fact right now, right from that the carbon-14 testing was completely wrong, because you have two cloths that were both touching the same dead body, one of which we've had in our possession and have clear tracing of back to the 7th century. So at the very least, we know that the shroud couldn't be any later than that. Okay. That was a real win for those of us who love the shroud. And then something really crazy, and this is where they make movies, happened in 2017. There was a young, I believe he might have been a doctoral student. He could have been a master's candidate, but he was a statistician, trying to finish his degree and had to do his thesis. And he did his thesis using the data that had been released by the carbon-14 folks, that was released through the British Museum, through the journal Nature. And Nature is a place where a lot of historical data would be released, at least at that time. There are many others now. but that was one of the leading places. So he took that data and he was doing a statistical analysis on it, and he realized something didn't add up. There's data that was clearly missing. So his name was Tristan. He filed the Freedom of Information Act and said, hey, my tests clearly demonstrate that you did not release all the data, at least not to the journal Nature. I would like to see the rest of the data so that I can finish my work. They would not give it to him. So he did have to file a Freedom of Information Act request in the European Union. And when he got all the data, and they did have to release it to him, he realized, wait a second. The reason you didn't release all the data is because all the data doesn't say the same thing. Matter of fact, the data actually would have led anyone who knows anything about carbon-14 dating to recognize that the test was invalid from the onset. So that pretty much was the end and debunked the carbon-14 testing. Although, again, I still run into people all the time, the predominance of people who actually still believe in the carbon-14 testing because they don't know any of this because it never made it into major news media. And then we've had a very recent update, and from a science perspective, that strangely enough happened really between 2019 and 2022, but first reported in 2022. So I'm recording this in 2024. So this is 2 years ago when it was reported. Strangely enough, about 6 weeks ago, this is September of 2024, about 6, maybe 8 weeks ago now, major news media all over the world finally caught up to this. And there was a couple of days where everyone was reporting this information as if it was brand new in 2024. Just tells you a little bit about, what you read through news media. It may not always be accurate, nor may it be current. But there was the Italy Institute of Crystallography pioneered a new testing method called X-ray dating, which is both more precise and more reliable than carbon-14. So where the Fonti tests were more reliable, they lacked the precision. Well, the X-ray dating is both more precise and more reliable. And what they found, just to cut to the short, is, this cloth is definitely around 2,000 years old. Okay, boom. All right. Now they also said that they were able to tell where it spent time. They propose a slightly different pathway. They see Jerusalem to Beirut, not to Edessa, then to Constantinople, Liri, Chambéry, and Turin. So they agree with the theory that I presented in part 1 for the most part, but they wipe out the Edessa stop and replace it with a Beirut stop. Although they admit they could be wrong, okay, on that. But they believe that Beirut is the city that would have left the markings they see through the X-ray dating, which again is looking at some of the natural recurring elements that they can find in this linen fabric. I'm gonna stick with the original theory, although again, just always want to remind people that original theory was a combination of historical fact, where you have secondary and tertiary sources, and a little bit of pious legend that has been carried forward for a great deal of time, thousands of years, but still legend nonetheless. So could be wrong here, but for 90% of what they came up with, they confirmed what we had proposed anyway. So it's not super relevant. So here's the question: as we sit here in 2024, could this have been forged? And let's actually take a look at that. All right. Well, what would a forger have had to do? That's how we're going to look at this. First off, he would have had to obtain a 1,300-year-old linen cloth in the 14th century. So if this was indeed a 14th century forgery, as the British Museum so proudly announced, we now know that the cloth is 2,000 years old. So somehow this person would have had to get a 1,300-year-old linen cloth. He would have then had to travel to specific locations around the world, whether you go with the Jerusalem-Edessa or Jerusalem-Beirut path. He would have to travel to all those destinations and stayed there, okay, for and exposing that linen cloth to the natural environment for periods of time to get the right level of pollen concentrations to fool everybody 700 years later, okay? By the way, the guy who was doing this would have somehow had to have known that pollen dating and pollen location tracking technology would have been created, because it didn't exist in the 14th century. Clearly, there's a 20th century scientific breakthrough. So this forger would have been, clairvoyant and genius to a level beyond what you would have seen. That's the first thing they would have to do. Then they would have to find the person with the right blood type to beat, torture, crucify, make sure it was all done while they're standing, and spear using authentic first century Roman weapons. And then they would have to rub the body with Jerusalem dirt in just the right places so that it would leave the right imprints on the cloth. Again, as I point out here, this was not just a master forger, it was a pretty cruel murderer as well. So a sadistic forger at best. Then he would have had to ignore history. So the 14th century forger would have never have known that a crown of thorns would have been a skull cap. Every artistic image showed it as a ringlet. So that's what a person would have known. That's what everybody thought. It wasn't until archaeologists uncovered finds in the 20th century that we learned that first century kings and queens would not have worn a ringlet, as we always see in movies, and as we see on most of our crucifixes today. But he would have worn a skull cap. A crown of thorns would have been a skull cap, that would have covered his entire head. Would have been much more brutal, quite frankly. But this guy would have had to have known something no one else knew at the time. So that's pretty amazing. He would have to place the body on the cloth to get the blood smears, but then remove the body without distorting any of the smears, because the smears are not distorted. They're not rubbed. They're not shifted. It's clear that the blood dried on a body that did not move. So this guy would have done something that is impossible to do. Okay. This is just one of many things so far that have been impossible to do. But he would have done that so that he could fool the 20th century forensic scientists that are going to be studying this thing. So he would have already also had predicted that forensic science was going to become a thing, and they would be able to detect that there was some sort of body movement, which again, this guy is unbelievable what he figured out. Then he would have had to use an unknown technique to create the image. It's a technique we still do not have, that we cannot replicate, although we have a pretty good theory now, and was apparently never used again. This is the only image that's ever been found that was created this way. We don't know the way, but we know the product, and no other image has ever been created like this, and we've been looking. Okay, so this forger somehow created something super unique, but then choose not to use it to make money. Okay, choose not to put it to his own advantage. This forger would have somehow have gotten his hands on the Sudarium of Oviedo, which has been under lock and key and closely guarded since the 7th century. So he would have had to get it 700 years later, take it and make sure that he matched all the puncture wounds and got some of the same blood type and all this kind of good stuff. Well, by the way, we didn't know how to do blood typing yet. Okay, so just crazy what he had to do to get this done. Then he would have had to find these Pontius Pilate coins that no one knew existed, certainly not in the 14th century. No one knew existed to the 20th century. I have to find some. We only have a handful. There's only been a handful found. And place 2 on the eyes of the person that is in the image, knowing that somewhere down the road we would invent digital photography that could actually detect it, because normal photography could not detect it. It had to be high definition digital photography was the only way this was detectable. So this forger was really forward thinking. He's trying to fool people, who are going to come centuries after him. And then he would have to anticipate something like the SP8 image analyzer and 3D imaging, again, to fool the 20th century scientists into thinking this was authentic. So again, this guy, just unbelievable. I want to meet him. And he'd have to do this without leaving any trail. No witnesses, no nothing. No one knows him. No one ever heard of him. He never made any claims, the whole 9 yards. And by the way, he never produced anything else, which would have been invaluable. Okay, this guy could have made a killing producing relics, and yet this is it. It was once and done with no benefit. Okay, so pretty hard to believe. That hopefully you realize you'd have to be, I hate to say this, you'd have to be a moron to believe this could be forged. And that's just, I'm just being honest, okay? The quantum leaps you would have to make. You would have to think this guy could do everything I just described. Things that no one can do today, he would have to be able to do. He would have had to have clear visions of what technologies would exist in the future and anticipate people would apply these technologies to this cloth. Insane, okay? So hopefully you realize that the whole idea of the forgery out the window. So what is the image hypothesis, which now I'm going to talk about as really a theory, because over the last several years, really since about 2020, people have come to the conclusion this is more than a hypothesis. This is likely how this occurred. So the hypothesis is that if whatever was wrapped in this cloth emitted an extremely short, high-intensity burst of ultraviolet radiation, you could actually create an image, a 3D photographic negative image on a linen cloth. Well, lo and behold, we've actually tested this in a limited way. So we've never been able to reproduce it to the scale of what we see on the shroud, but in a very limited way, we've actually been able to demonstrate that, yes, a high-intensity, extremely short ultraviolet radiation burst would indeed leave an image on a linen cloth, okay? That's why it's moved into theory. But in order for this to have worked, this light would have had to been coming out of the body while the body was becoming mechanically transparent, which means it was losing its physical, the physical properties of nature, where you could touch it and feel it and not walk through it, because it appears as if the cloth actually traveled through the body, which is why the image only appears on the uppermost fibers, and that is how it got the encoded 3D information as the image was being made, okay? Also explains why we actually, in the detailed images, can actually see bone structure, because the cloth was traveling through the body, through the bones, as the body itself was becoming mechanically transparent. So, you know, pretty intense hypothesis. And they figured it out. They did the math. It would take 14,000 excimer lasers. That's more than exists in the world today. Okay, certainly more than existed way back then. Okay, it would take that many lasers fired, you know, at the same time for 1/40 billionth of a second. Because if it was any longer, it would have burned the shroud to bits. So this was super intense emission over a very instantaneous period of time of ultraviolet light. So this thing just lit up, and as the body was disappearing, the shroud's falling through the disappearing body, leaving the image in its wake. That's the hypothesis. So if it's true, it would mean that sometime after the blood dried on the shroud, remember the image came after the blood, this decomposing body emitted a powerful burst of ultraviolet radiation from every point within itself at the same time while becoming mechanically transparent. And this is something that we have never seen a human body do, and will likely never see do again, all right? So again, a hypothesis that is now become a theory, that is in of itself is pretty wild. But it does explain what we found. So where the STURP team couldn't explain it, no one else could explain it for literally centuries. This is something that actually would result in what we found on the shroud. And it's just interesting. You know, Jesus spoke to them again saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. You know, I think Jesus has a pretty good sense of humor. I am the light of the world. Well, maybe he is. He's the ultraviolet light of the world, an amazing burst of light that left us an incredible clue, an incredible piece of evidence as to how he spent his final days and how he resurrected from the dead. So my opinion, the preponderance of the evidence, and that's what you should always base it on. You never base your conclusions on one piece of evidence, or you know, you want to see evidence that all points in a similar direction. It may not be, you know, 100% duplicatable, so it's not pointing exactly to the same thing, but you're looking for the preponderance. And you know, I think you'd have to be really obstinate, and again, I'm going to use that term, a moron of some sort, To not recognize that this linen cloth is 2,000 years old with clear ties to Palestine. It does indeed display a mysterious image of a man with wounds that precisely match those that are described by Jesus Christ in the gospel accounts. We know this image wasn't used with any known ancient or modern technique. And while this theory exists, we still can't produce an image of this size using that theory or putting that theory into action. That's number one. Number two, the combination of reliable historical accounts and chains of custody, provenance, some very pious tradition, because again, always want to mention that, and some reasonable speculation to connect the dots point to the shroud being authentic. Early tradition and Christian practice supports it. A reasonable examination of verifiable through multiple sources historical events explain how it could have traveled from Jerusalem to France and eventually Italy. And that provenance of the Sudarium is a key, because having that clearly documented going into the 600s, so the 7th century, really means that at the very least, we know that these two cloths were together at some point in that century. And by the way, the Sudarium has a chain of provenance that's broken prior to the 700s, but it has a history that goes way back to the 1st century as well. So again, I'm really just trying to be very specific here about what we know for fact versus what we know with legend and tradition, and things of that nature. So I look at all this, and it's hard not to believe. And what I really think is it's clear it could not have been forged. Okay, it's impossible. Couldn't have happened. All right. We can't do it today. We couldn't go out to make that forgery today, with all the technology we have at our disposal. And, the motivation for forgeries was clear. I mean, it would make sense that someone would try it. But it would be impossible for a medieval forger to even consider. We can't do it today. And if he had been able to do it, why would he do it just once? Okay. The forgery, if we could create a forgery, that in itself would be a miracle. All right. So that's the crazy thing. In order to believe the forgery theory, you have to believe in a miracle. You have to believe that the miraculous forgery occurred. So it's just so ironic. When I point that out to people that will continue to argue the forgery theory, they really have no response to that, because in many cases, for the first time, it's dawning on them that in them trying to dispute that miracles occur, which is one of the reasons people will fight against this, they are actually calling on or necessitating a miracle to have occurred in order to defeat the miracle of the shroud itself. So it's just irony over irony. So what is it? It's the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It is a gift of God to help our unbelief. And this, I always think of this passage in Mark where it talks about Jesus healing the son of this man. And, Jesus says to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. And the man is so honest. He goes, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. And isn't that what we're all struggling with? We believe, but we always have our doubts, always have that, I haven't seen it, tasted it, touched it, felt it, heard it. I'm having a tough day believing today. Well, I think what we have here with the shroud is a gift. I think God said, I know people are going to struggle, so I'm going to give them something that will help. And again, is it definitive without any possible doubt? No. There's definitely some doubts there. Is it definitive, without any reasonable doubt? I actually think yes. I think there's possible doubt. I don't think that doubt is very reasonable. Okay. I think you'd have to be unreasonable to have significant doubts here. So that's just my opinion. And what does it mean for our faith? Well, it does matter. I think it's a great gift. I think we now know this is what Jesus actually looked like. And I think that's beautiful. I have this image hanging in my home office, and I often find myself looking at it and just trying to imagine the man behind this face. And also, I look at the whole image and look at the pain and suffering it tells the story of, and you really can't help but sometimes get emotional to see it and realize what he's done for us. So yes, from that perspective, it matters, but in reality, it doesn't really matter. Okay, because it really doesn't have anything to do with our faith. It can help us overcome our unbelief, and that is a great gift, and I love that. Okay, but intellectual belief is not faith. Okay, and that's an important thing to know. Faith is a gift of God, and you can't study your way, reason your way into faith, and that's a reality. So this doesn't give us faith. This can support our faith, help us in those moments when we're struggling with faith. I think it has all sorts of other tremendous advantages for us as Catholic Christians. But again, does it really matter? No, right? And that is why the church doesn't come out and make a clear, definitive statement one way or the other, because it really doesn't matter. Okay, real or not, the church has come out, and most of our recent popes, if not all of the last 5 or 6, have been very deferential when it comes to the shroud, and venerated the shroud. So from their example, you see they believe. But we're not required as Catholics to believe any of this. And I think it's just one of those tools God has given us to help our unbelief, but it's up to us to either choose to use the tool or deny it. To either use the tool or, again, hate to say it, become moronic. So really the question for you for watching this, and hopefully you enjoyed it, is, is this the face of Jesus? And I think my answer is yes, it is. All right. So to give credit where credit is due, it's not as if I spent a lifetime researching the Shroud of Turin. What I did is I begged, borrowed, and stole from other researchers. So I took some of the work of John Jackson and Barry Schwartz, two of the original STURP researchers, Raymond Schneider, Robert Spitzer, Father Spitzer of the Magis Center here in Southern California, has done a lot of work here consolidating data. A book called The Vatican Prophecies by John Tavis, The Catholic Scientist Champions of Shroud of Turin by Gerard Verschuren, which is, okay. But primarily, a lot of the background that I gave you today, especially historical background and tracing it through time, comes from Ian Wilson's really landmark book called The Shroud. So this is the go-to book on shroud theory, and doesn't have the latest scientific info in it. So the last 20 years or so. But it is an amazing book. And most of the images, either pulling from the public internet, some of the sites managed by this gentleman above, or the movie The Passion of the Christ, which I think is an excellent, excellent film depicting the horrors of the torture that Jesus went through. If you want some of those websites, here they are on the screen for you. You can take a picture of that and check them out. And then I gave you a little bit more information about the books that I've read and used and stolen from, and where you can get them, or give you a little note on what they mean. So feel free to check those out. And again, if you have any questions, love to answer them. I love to talk about the shroud. And hopefully at this point, you've learned enough to say, wow, this is amazing. And if I've been able to accomplish that, I'm thrilled. So let us end in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, you are amazing, and you give us so many gifts, and we often forget. Matter of fact, we seem to forget them immediately. And I thank you for the shroud. The shroud has been something that I've come back to over and over again. I hope these fine people watching this will now feel comfortable coming back to it and using it as a source of renewing faith and reviving faith when I have doubts and struggles. And thank you for that great gift. Thank you for the gift of your Son. We just ask that you open our hearts and minds and let us accept that gift, and let us take that gift and introduce others to it. And we ask this in your holy name. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thanks, folks. Take care.